Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending your lunch hour learning about serverless with us. I'm Rachel. I'm your moderator today. I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at RevStar, Cloud Native Software Development Agency, as well as the founder of Women in Tech and Entrepreneurship. I am so thrilled to be joined by an amazing lineup of tech experts in this panel today. Thank you to Patar, the Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity at A-LIGN, bringing his powerful security and compliance background, to Shure, the AWS Partner Solutions Architect on our call, bringing lots of industry-leading expertise on serverless, and in particular for the startups on the call today, and Ken Pamela, the founder and CEO of RevStar. He has been working with health tech founders and building secure, compliant platforms for many years and brings a wealth of expertise. We will be opening up the floor to your direct questions. We know that many of you are very intellectually curious and you're here because you want to ask the experts questions that you have. So please be thinking about those throughout. Drop them in the chat, and at the end, please hop on camera, on microphone, and ask your questions. So without any further ado, we are going to dive right into our discussion today. I want to start out with Ken and Patar. I think to set the stage for this conversation and the benefit that we can all hope to gain from what we'll learn today, I'd like to talk about the practical, the real world. Can you share, each of you, a case study where a health tech startup successfully was able to balance its speed, scale, and compliance using serverless technologies?
I can start. I have a favorite that I can share. I worked with a health tech startup. They wanted to build an on-demand prescription delivery platform, and this was right at the onset of COVID, so February, March 2020. So there was a sense of urgency to get a minimum viable product out. They were also targeting some really large partnerships with pharmacy networks and some large payers. So there was also a need to kind of check off all of the boxes, right? So it had to be built to meet HIPAA compliance standards. It had to be built to scale, deal with, being a small MVP with an initial partnership and to be able to scale up very quickly. So when we were having those initial conversations, for me, it was a no-brainer to leverage serverless technologies. This platform had a lot of different components, so there's multiple web applications for different users, such as pharmacies and the internal teams at the client. There's mobile applications that the drivers use, and so all of that is built around a shared service layer using microservices that are built in Lambda on AWS. And what that was able to do is allow us to quickly build a platform. We were able to get an MVP out within 4 months, take it to market, and that same platform exists today. It's scaled up to doing deliveries in over 20 states. So there was a point where we got into our first actual compliance audit. So while the system met HIPAA compliance standards, the client needed to achieve a SOC audit, SOC 2 type 2 for a certain partnership. And those same principles that allowed us to be HIPAA compliant allowed us to also get through that audit very seamlessly. So when we talk about serverless, we talk about not having to deal with the scope of servers running, patching servers, antivirus on servers. When we talk about the actual shared infrastructure, AWS has business associate agreements that they can leverage and give to healthcare customers, SOC 2 Type 2 certifications that we could then submit with all of the documentation of the system. So it takes out a lot of the scope of physical infrastructure and the security and monitoring and logging of any physical infrastructure and even virtual servers. So it was a game changer for the customer. They grew very quickly, as I mentioned, and still utilize that platform today.
Thanks, Ken. And now I'll keep mine a little more general, and again put a flavor on compliance. And again, Rachel, thanks for the introductions and setting this up. So in the context of health tech startups, in this specific case, we had an organization that we had worked with that was working to develop a telemedicine platform to support real-time patient consultations. Again, just maybe a little background on the line so that you know where I'm coming from. We are a cybersecurity and a primarily compliance shop. Over 4,000 customers. A lot of them are in the healthcare space, and a lot of startups. And as you can imagine, one of the worst fears of any startup is hearing compliance and security requirements. That hurdle that gets in your way. So in this specific case, what are some of the challenges that organization faced? And we always talk about three things. One, speed. How do you accelerate development and deployment so that you can get to your customers? The second, key pillar that was scalability. The platform must scale seamlessly to handle patient volume fluctuations. You might have a couple of people, you might have a couple of hundred or more. And third, which is probably the most relevant to us as a health tech solution, something that handles PHI, EPHI, the organization had to comply with some of the strict data protection regulations. Ken mentioned HIPAA being one of them, to ultimately ensure that patient information is secure and private. So in this specific case, the organization was able to adopt an actual serverless architecture, which in essence means utilizing a managed service from a cloud provider such as AWS that Sure is representing today, to ultimately utilize a lot of those built-in compliance features. So again, remember, speed, scalability, compliance, those are the three main pillars that we focused on. Using serverless on the speed side, in essence, the startup was able to eliminate the need for any infrastructure management. Kind of like Ken mentioned, all you're doing is focusing on your software. So in this case, the developers were able to focus purely on coding and deploying features. Second one, scalability. That was one of the key implications here. Serverless technologies, as you know, automatically can scale based on demand, which ultimately enabled that platform provider to allow for some of those spikes in usage without any manual intervention. For an application such as, in this case, telemedicine, where uninterrupted service is critical for patient care, scalability is, I'd say, probably as key, if not more important than speed and ultimately compliance. And then the compliance portion is where we come into play. Serverless architecture, as you guys know, is built, in this case, on a HIPAA compliant cloud provider. So features such as encryption, access controls, I know Ken mentioned a few other ones, audit logs, those are all things that are requirements to have in place in order to secure that protected health information, or PHI. I'm sure you'll hear that term quite a few times today. Being able to place your solution in a compliant environment allows you to meet those regulatory requirements without ultimately diverting those significant resources to manage security in-house. In this case, what did that give the company the opportunity to do? They were able to focus on enhancing the user experience, building the platform, deploying it faster, and ultimately doing that in a secure fashion. So again, Ken, just echoing what you said. Back to you, Rachel.
Amazing. Really, really great insight, fellas. And I want to kind of pivot over to Shure and get into some of the, still setting the stage, right? Some of the advantages of serverless technology over traditional cloud computing models, especially as we think about those health tech applications. And I think this actually starts to address some of the questions that we saw in the chat earlier while we were waiting to log in.
Yeah, so I'll just pick up where Peter left off. Serverless provides similar advantages to the health tech space that it does to other fields, particularly it being cost effective, where you only pay for what you use. It is scalable, right? You can add thousands of users and your application will scale to accommodate that. But more importantly, it also scales down to zero when nothing is going on. But one thing that is common across different fields or segments, I should say, is that this technology is operationally efficient. And not just what I mentioned, but I think it lowers your total cost of operation by having your developers, your IT teams focus on what differentiates you as a business, which is your business logic, which is your application, and not do undifferentiated heavy lifting like patching servers, right? So these are things that we see commonly across all industries. But I think one specific place where I think serverless shines for health tech is the flexibility and extensibility that it offers. So, for example, I had a customer that wanted to integrate with they acquired an organization and they wanted to integrate with their existing systems, and they already had an application running. So it was just a few minor changes in a few Lambda functions that allowed them to basically integrate seamlessly, right? Which would have taken a lot of time if you were developing or you had a monolithic application, because your application components were not loosely coupled. So I think flexibility is one of them. And the second thing I see with serverless is the extensibility. For example, you have an application that's already designed, running, but you want to add a new feature, or you are now ingesting new data that needs to be handled by your existing system. So I think that is where I see serverless stand out in the health tech space, offering flexibility and extensibility, whether it's a new application or an existing application. And back to you, Rachel.
I appreciate your insights. So valuable and so helpful. So Ken, I'd like to talk more specifically about RevStar for a minute and how you in particular have been able to use serverless technologies and cloud development to accelerate product development cycles. I know you have worked in cloud native development for a very long time, and you set out with a specific mission for RevStar to do this.
Yeah, I think we work with a lot of startups, right? And when you think about the the barrier to getting started, if you're having to lay out capital to buy equipment, uh, a location to host the equipment, this is a lot of money spent just to get started, right? When we think about how we can move with serverless technologies, there's there's no barrier to just starting development, right? So you can come to us with your requirements. We can do some, design and architecture and come up with a solution, and then just start building, right? I made a joke earlier about standing at the door to the IT ops team asking for, for a server or access to deploy your code. We just don't have those barriers, right? So we can get right into the product development lifecycle. Some founders are funding these platforms with their retirement money that they saved up while they were working, or they don't have a lot of capital to invest. So when you think about taking the tens of thousands, if not more, dollars that are spent on buying physical infrastructure and somewhere to host it, that now goes into building your minimum viable product. So it accelerates the whole process. You have working MVP done where you could be waiting for hardware to be shipped, to be set up, and then you have the ongoing maintenance, right? You need a development team, right? You don't need an ops team. There's not somebody that's having to monitor servers. There's not a lot of break fix in the infrastructure, so it just lowers your overall total cost of ownership. And like, I think startups, that's perfect. This is the same concept for existing businesses, right? When you look at, everybody's worried about profitability. The more people and the more capital expenditures you have for hardware, that money gets invested into those things versus growing your core competencies and the things that really differentiate your business.
Ken, one thing to add really quickly to that, just to echo what you said, I think one of the other great advantages is I think a lot of startups, we see them thinking pretty small, right? Hey, we'll get a handful of users and we'll get the right infrastructure to support that. And some of those explode. They get a lot more users than what they expected. And, that on-prem solution can no longer, support what it needs to support. So you don't have that problem in the serverless environment. So, certainly something to be considered.
Yeah, I think you don't have to make compromises, right? You can build quickly, you can get a cost-effective minimum viable product, and you can scale on it. It kind of gets you that you know, I think convergence of all the best of everything. Where to your point, even if you bought a cheap server and had it sitting on the floor at your house, if you get any kind of traction, you're in trouble, right? And you can't rebuild your platform and redeploy your platform while users are trying to access it, right? You kind of get one chance to make a good impression, so you don't want to cut corners. And this allows you, I think, like I said, to kind of get the best of everything.
Fantastic. And again, we are going to open the floor up to questions in about 20 minutes here. So I hope you guys are taking your notes. Patar, can you tell us a little bit about some of the best practices for maintaining compliance with healthcare regulations like HIPAA when adopting those serverless architectures?
Sounds good, Rachel. And I don't know how much time you guys have. Compliance question. Happy to chat through that. But it starts with, in this case, since we're talking about serverless architectures, choosing a HIPAA compliant serverless service provider. So again, Shire's here from AWS. I think that's a good example of, you know, an organization that offers those services. The whole concept there is those are services and configurations that are designed to meet the HIPAA requirements. So, you know, something that you don't have to worry about. One of the things that you'll probably come across is you'll be asked to sign a BAA or a business associate agreement, something that, you know, those of you that worked in healthcare should know pretty well. It is a HIPAA requirement for any third party that handles PHI. So that's step one. There's a lot of things that, you know, organizations should be looking at. I'll kind of spit out a few of them, and I can certainly elaborate on any of them once we have, you know, a little more time for questions at the end. But one, using strong data encryption, and that includes encrypting PHI both in transit and at rest. Serverless providers typically offer those encryption options for you. Implementing access controls and identity management, that's very key and probably one of the most common misconceptions when using serverless. You know, it's not always the provider's responsibility. There's a lot of things that, you know, the organizations have to do themselves. So ultimately, what you need to be doing is implementing a role-based access control to restrict that access based on job responsibilities. You know, you hear the term least privilege. One of the other things to be considered is leveraging an MFA or multi-factor authentication for all users and administrators. That just adds an extra layer of security to that PHI access. Using secure APIs and authentication, I'm sure Ken can elaborate a lot more on that, but that's very critical when it comes to maintaining compliance and security. Audit logging and monitoring. And again, for those of you that have gone through a HIPAA security assessment, you know that a lot of these kind of tie back to some of those HIPAA requirements, but enabling detailed logging for all access and any modifications to PHI. You know, HIPAA does mandate audit capabilities for any system that manages healthcare data. So make sure that you have that available. One of the things that we come across as we grow in kind of the geographic footprint of some of organizations that we work with, ensuring data residency and backup compliance. You need to confirm that PHI remains in an approved geographic region. You know, HIPAA, some of the other regulations that you probably come across may have requirements regarding data residency. And I'm sure Sherry can talk about, you know, the different landing zones that AWS has for, you know, those reasons. Frankly, privacy is also not to be underestimated here. You know, securing your serverless function with the least privilege. Again, I mentioned that earlier, but configuring each of those functions to operate with the minimum level of privilege necessary to perform its task, as I mentioned earlier, known as the principle of least privilege. That's something that we always look for when we do our assessments. A couple of other things, you know, conducting regular compliance audits and testing. Certainly, you know, goes without saying, but that should include vulnerability assessments of your serverless environment to ultimately identify and address any security gaps that you may have. And I'd say last, definitely not least, establishing a robust breach response plan. You know, in the event of a data breach, hopefully none of you have had to deal with that. I have, supporting many organizations, but HIPAA mandates that affected individuals, as well as some institutions like the Department of Health and Human Services, be notified within a very specific timeline, depending on where they're located, states-wide, country, and all that. Having a breach response plan that includes those communication protocols, the impact assessment, and a remediation strategy is key. Again, as I mentioned, I have supported a few healthcare and insurance companies through some of those breaches, and I can tell you advanced preparation or lack thereof is very key. It can be a very long and stressful process, and the more you have planned from how do you define a breach to all the different steps from day 0 to say day 30, day 60 when you have everything cleared, the more you plan in advance, the easier your life will be. And we always say in the security and compliance space, it's not a matter of if, it's a when. So prepare ahead of time. Don't wait until something bad happens to, call someone and say, hey, I need help. So back to you, Rachel. Hopefully that answered your question.
It does, and then some. And hopefully, if any of you are struggling with how to devise those plans, you'll be able to connect with Pitar directly after the call here. And we'll have lots more time to ask those questions. But moving back to Shure, I'd love to dig in a little bit deeper into the technical aspects here of how we can integrate AWS Lambda and other AWS serverless architectures to build a fully serverless health tech application. And then what are those kind of top technical considerations as someone explores this process?
Yeah, so again, I'll be going off of what Pitar said in the last question, but let's address the use of serverless services. When we talk about serverless services, even my foray into this field was through a Lambda function, right? But we have to understand that Lambda function is just a compute service. And when it comes to serverless, there are a multitude of services. We have an entire spectrum that includes databases, that includes other serverless compute. For example, Fargate, when you want to run your workloads as container workloads. We've got messaging systems, SQS, notification systems. We've got event routers, event brokers. So anything that you need is available to you. So putting these systems together will allow you to build a full application. And a lot of times I also encounter scenarios where customers assume serverless is only good for the front end or back end or only for asynchronous processes. What I want to say is if you find your needs first and then pick a solution, and you'll notice that with AWS you can pick a lot of these services and they integrate with each other. So sending messages or using the SDK to develop with all of these together is very easy. And you can, I don't want to say very easy, it is something that will help you deploy your application successfully. So a multitude of services, but so a variety of services is one thing you should consider, and number one, how well they integrate with one another. Combining those two, you can build pretty much any application. And I think I also want to emphasize Lambda runs code. So even if you are not dealing with something that is serverless, for example, you have a workload that takes more than 15 minutes to run and you would like to use, let's say, an EC2 instance for that. It is still possible for you to control that and instantiate that resource using a Lambda function, because anything that you can write in code using the AWS SDK can run inside a Lambda function. So, and in addition to that, I do want to raise that we have a shared responsibility model in AWS. Our AWS services are HIPAA eligible, but you do have to set them up correctly, right? So we'll talk more about what technical steps you can take to accomplish that. But I also want to add to Peter's point, we encourage teams to run game days where you test out your infrastructure and you figure out what happens in the event of a failure. So again, with serverless, you're capable of conducting these tests before an event at scale. So not just a limited environment, but at scale. So these are some things that allow you to use AWS serverless services and build a complete application.
Fantastic. So, lot to consider when we're kicking off the development process. And I think that sometimes, I know no one on this call would ever do this, but sometimes, especially in the startup world, we can think of security and compliance as an afterthought, and I'll get to it after I have my MVP. But Ken, having dealt with this a lot, can you tell us a little bit about how integrating that security and compliance from the very beginning really impacts the development process, and why in the long run this is better beyond the obvious risk aspects?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll kind of piggyback off the shared responsibility model. A lot of times when we work with customers, they don't necessarily understand, well, what is AWS responsible for? What is my development team responsible for? And then what is the greater organization responsible for? So there's a lot of pieces there. So, there is security controls on the AWS side. We can have multi-factor authentication on our logins to the console, right? We have IAM to govern identity access management for the console, right? Those are kind of table stakes things. But then when we talk about code, we have to build role-based access control into our custom platforms, right? That's a responsibility of the development team. AWS has services like KMS that do out-of-the-box encryption, but I have to apply them to my database, right? I have to apply them to my any data at rest, any data in transit, right? So there's the all the bones are there, but you have to set them up correctly. And so those are some things that you have to want to think about ahead of time, right? And then there's the compliance at the organization level, right? Are you background checking employees? Do you have, Mark Pitar mentioned it earlier, proper incident response? Do you have a good, even on the development team, do you have a good code review process, right? A tightly controlled SDLC, software development lifecycle? Do you have proper change management, or are you, sometimes when you're a startup, people are just shouting things over the fence to you, and you're trying to sit there and code them and release them. And so having some I think control around the process, and it's sometimes it's tough to push back when you're already in flight, right? If you're 6 months into an MVP and you haven't been following these best practices, trying to then shoehorn those in there after can be shocking from a culture perspective. And so, well, 3 months ago, you told me, yes, when I asked you to do this, now I have to fill out a change management form, or, trying to go back in and implement role-based access control in a code base where you didn't have it is a lot more difficult than just building it that way in the first place. So you want to start out with a good plan. You want to make sure you're covering all of these aspects before you dig in and just start coding. So while there's components of the infrastructure where we can start putting things into lambdas very quickly, for example, you want to make sure that what you're planning to build and what you're planning to put in those lambdas, or put in that serverless database, will fall within those compliance controls.
Excellent. And Qatar, what are the common security challenges that you see with startups who are maybe implementing serverless? How can they mitigate some of those risks?
That's a great question, Rachel. And frankly, I'll piggyback off of something that Ken said. I think it all starts with knowing what you're responsible for versus what is covered by, say, your hosting provider. The shared responsibility matrix that Shireen and Ken mentioned. Things such as user administration, identity access management, background checks. I can't tell you how often I see a vendor questionnaire where all the answers are marked off as yes. And then when you start digging deeper, I'm like, hey, who does your monitoring? Oh, AWS. Who does your identity access management, provisioning and deprovisioning? AWS. I'm like, really? I'm like, they control your users. So, start by knowing what it is that you're responsible for. Again, organizations like AWS have great responsibility matrices that you can look at of exactly what you're inheriting. Once you have that established, I'd say some of the key things to be considered, and frankly, some of the ones that are more challenging for startups are, one, data exposure. Serverless functions pretty often interact with databases or third-party services where, you may have some of that sensitive data or PHI, and that can be exposed. Again, with the risk of repeating myself, encrypting data both in transit and at rest, or using a dedicated service like I know AWS has the Secrets Manager, are key things to ultimately securely storing that secret information to avoid any hard coding credentials. The second thing that's challenging for organizations tends to be access controls and identity management. So without effective access control, ultimately unauthorized individuals could gain access to functions or data. As I mentioned earlier, it is pretty critical for startups to use the least privilege identity and access management principles and policies to enforce multi-factor authentication, and ultimately to use secure authentication protocols for any APIs that handle sensitive data. Some of the other things that I've seen as challenging, I mentioned, monitoring and logging. Serverless can be challenging to monitor, again, due to its, stateless and distributed nature. Enabling comprehensive logging or using cloud monitoring tools to detect anomalies. One day I'll learn how to pronounce this word in real time to ensure that any suspicious activity is caught early is pretty critical. But again, overall, know your data, know your exposure, and make sure that you know what is covered by your serverless hosting provider versus what is your responsibility. Again, we see this over and over again where organizations, point a finger at AWS and say, oh, we thought it was covered. Again, it's a lot easier to, have those conversations up front, make sure that you're setting up your environment properly, rather than have to respond to an auditor when, I ask for identity and access management, say user provisioning, deprovisioning, periodic reviews, and, organizations are pretty clueless. So have those conversations with, the folks at AWS, make sure that you know what they're providing, and ultimately make sure that anything that is your responsibility is being addressed and is being addressed properly.
If I can add a practical example, I'll keep it very short. When you're working with serverless functions, right, and you're about to receive PHI, protected health information, and you are using a Lambda function to process it, by default, that does not help you meet the compliance requirement. So you need to ask yourself, where is my data coming from? Is it going to be encrypted? If it's encrypted, what key are we going to use to encrypt or decrypt that data? How is Lambda going to access that key? And then once we're done processing, transforming that data, is it going to be written to a database? Is that going to be encrypted at rest once it gets there? And how are the links between these services when we make these calls? Are these encrypted in transit? Are these traversing the public internet? Are we accessing this through a private link? So I think these are some of the questions that you have to ask. And AWS does provide you a lot of guidance in the documentation on how to meet compliance building with serverless systems, but that definitely falls on the builder's responsibility in the shared responsibility model. So it's very important to understand what you own, what you are responsible for, and what AWS does for you.
Yeah, to kind of put this in perspective, when we're helping customers fill out vendor assessment questionnaires that they need as SaaS providers, there's usually an on-premise section, and that's maybe 400 questions. It's ridiculous. And then a cloud section will be 150. And then when you start to go into it, there'll be a lot of non-applicable pieces with serverless, but there's still quite a few, let's call it 100 things you're checking off that you're still responsible for as an organization or a development team. So it doesn't necessarily achieve compliance at a greater scale, but it does take out quite a bit of scope if you build a serverless cloud-based application versus something you're hosting on premise.
All right, so we have just about enough time for one last question for our speakers before we turn it over to our audience. I would like us to just dig a little bit deeper into the resources at AWS to ensure that serverless meet the stringent security and compliance requirements in the healthcare industry, simply because I believe there are a lot of people who have joined this call who are looking to try to navigate that space better. And one of our missions here is to connect them with those resources.
Yeah, so I'll take that. I'm not going to bore everybody with the details of each service and what we offer, but I'll give you an overview. And more importantly, I think I want to talk about partners like A-LIGN and RevStar and how you folks come into that conversation. So, like Peter mentioned, right, when you are trying to discuss compliance, whether you're operating in the US and you have to meet HIPAA compliance, or you're operating in the EU and you have GDPR, or matter of fact, any country out there, right, where you're operating or plan to operate, if you break down the basics of what is needed for requirements, I would say it 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 revolves around compliance with the service itself. There's data encryption. There is identity and access management, and the ability to log requests and audit them at a later point in time. So if I were to specifically list, I would say all of our AWS services are HIPAA eligible. You have to design and develop them in the right way to meet compliance. But we have key management service, which allows you to use keys to encrypt, decrypt. If you have existing keys, we also have services that allow you to bring in your key material or use key material that's on premises if that's something you prefer. So we have a variety of systems to allow encryption in transit and at rest. And then when we talk about serverless workloads and just access in general, we tend to think of people, right? But we also have to think about our serverless functions, which are constantly accessing data and potentially modifying data. So we also need to look at how we control that. And in AWS, we have identity and access management, by the way, which is my second favorite service if I were to list one after Lambda. And what it allows you to do is give you the ability to control at a very, very fine-grained level who has access to what. That's the fundamental question that service answers. So identity and access management is what gives you the ability to control access. And then finally, all of AWS services have metrics and logs that are reported through CloudWatch. And it is also possible for you to figure out who made a specific service API on the control plane using CloudTrail. So all of these services combined, put together properly, will allow you to meet compliance. Now, that itself makes me nervous, right? Put together properly. How do I ensure this is put together properly? If I'm a developer, yes, I have access to AWS documentation. I can go look that up. Now I can even ask Q these questions to skip looking at long documentation. But I think a critical piece for startups, particularly in the health tech space, is to work with a partner. So partners specialize in building specific software systems. They have experience in that industry domain, or they are partners who specialize in compliance, like A-LIGN, right? So I would highly encourage startups to leverage partners. And one last thing I do want to mention here is that when you leverage partners, AWS also has several funding programs that can be used to help you build your application, whether it's MVP, whether it's a migration, or a net new workload that you are building. Whatever it is, we have several programs that you can leverage, even for proof of concept, right? So if you're working with a partner, that gives you that ability to move fast, confidently, and deploy your application. So in summary, serverless technologies really allow you to focus on your core business logic, which is a beautiful thing, right? Because that's what differentiates you. But I recommend working with partners who have expertise in covering these other very important compliance and security requirements to be successful overall. And I think I went on a rant. I rambled over there. So back to you, Rachel.
Rachel,
That's
can I add something real quick to what Sherry said?
please.
Again, we work with startups all the way through Fortune 500s. And one of the things that we see very often is an organization starts by saying, hey, we need HIPAA compliance. But very quickly they grow, they want to sell to the government. Now we're talking about FISMA, we're talking about FedRAMP. Then they expand into Europe, we're talking about ISO 27001. Maybe they're working with some publicly traded companies that need a SOC report. So one of the charms of being hosted or using the AWS services is Sherry's talking about HIPAA, but AWS, most of their services undergo third-party audits for pretty much every compliance standard there is. So as your organization grows and comes across some of those new requirements, it's a lot easier to inherit the majority of the controls from your hosting provider than try to meet them yourself. And again, as someone who does all of those audits, I can tell you, being able to inherit controls goes a pretty long way. So again, that's just my 2 cents here.
Fabulous. Ken, anything that you'd like to add before we open the floor for questions?
No, I think that was well said. I think before you start, it's often good to go to an A-LIGN, somebody that can help advise you, right? So you know what you're getting into. And even if you come to us to help you build something, we'll bring partners like them in. There's obviously parts of compliance that we understand on the development side, but it's an organization-wide effort. So it's good to work with people who know what they're talking about instead of kind of taking a shot in the dark. When you think about just there are small things you can do to limit scope, and Pataro can probably talk about this a little bit more, but scope is important in these audits, right? So if you have your entire corporate network in scope versus a small footprint on the cloud, it's a lot shorter, a lot longer audit. So these are some of the things that you can save yourself a lot of time and headaches, bringing the right folks in to help you plan this in the first place.
All right, fantastic. So if we're not feeling shy and we have questions, I invite you to come on camera and shout your questions out for any of our speakers. We have a question in the chat from Lance. From the perspective of an engineering student who's interested in joining this field of serverless architecture, what skills or experience do you look for when people apply to your company? Are there any unique skills that you look for in applicants if your organization or company is working directly with healthcare startups?
So for us, obviously, if you're a student just graduating, we want to see that you're spending time, building little proofs of concepts yourself, having, code in a GitHub that you can show. There's really great tools at AWS, like a serverless framework that they have. There's Amplify. These are really cost-effective ways to learn how to build small applications, deploy them on the cloud. Sheree mentioned this earlier, but everything's pay as you go. If you're running a small Lambda function, you probably won't even be spending money to host it. So we like to see that you're taking the initiative. You don't have to build a functioning telehealth platform or anything like that, but just seeing that you're spending the time to learn these tools and build something and put it in your GitHub and bring that into your interview as part of your portfolio that you show.
One thing to add to what Ken said, Lance, is I think one of the things that a lot of organizations look for these days is just the initiative. I mean, there's a lot of trainings available. AWS has a ton of them for pretty much every technology, for cybersecurity, for compliance, and most of them are free. So showing the initiative, showing that you've taken some time away from your classes and other work to actually learn something that's not required goes a pretty long way. That's one of the things we always say. It's compliance and security are not a stagnant, it's not a stagnant science. It's something that changes all the time. So showing that you take the initiative, showing that you go out of your way to learn, and being able to speak to some of those classes, trainings, technologies that you've learned goes a very long way. And I'll give you a prime example. We have a dedicated team of penetration testers, so ethical hackers. One of the things that, most of those students will come with cybersecurity backgrounds. They know how to use Nessus, they built a Kali Linux, box, and they know the basics. But the ones that truly shine are the ones that say, "Hey, I spent the last 2 summers, building something at home, and here's what I was able to do, and here's a cool project that I did." It makes the interviews go so much smoother, being able to actually use a real-time example. So, like I said, class for grades, all that matters, but going above and beyond and taking advantage of some of those courses that are available out there and learning some of the technologies like Ken mentioned, it will set you apart from others very quickly.
If I can add my 2 cents, I felt like Ken and Pitar were speaking to me. I am not a student, but hey, I constantly have to learn and evolve, and I really emphasize, like if I were to go back and redo my serverless journey, right, which I started maybe in 2017, I would build. This is completely different. It's a different mindset. So instead of saying, I know how to use this service, show that you know how to use this service by building something and saying, hey, here's a project I built. I built a serverless ticketing system, what have you, right? So figure out what your passion project is, try to build that using serverless services, and then be able to speak about the benefits of using one versus the other. I think that is going to help you tremendously.
I think all the best developers I ever worked with did side projects, throughout their career, right? Not just before they got their first job. So I think it's one of those universal things. If you're curious and you're putting in the effort to learn new things, and like Sheree said, proving it by actually building something, you'll continue to do well from the beginning till the end of your career. I think you're muted.
Got time for one more question, I think, and then we've got some resources to share. All right, we've got a shy crowd today. So for those of you who are interested in taking this further, exploring more, I know we're all dialed in from all over the area, but as someone who sits here in Tampa Bay, I'd like to share that there is a HealthTech meetup hosted by Tampa General Hospital's venture arm at Embark Collective, which is one of the most successful incubators in the Southeast. It will be Tuesday, December 10th from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. This particular evening, they're going to focus on sports tech to enhance athlete performance and recovery. It is a great space to share ideas, meet other builders, and go a little further in your health tech startup journey. Another resource that is excellent for getting that hands-on experience building something and putting some projects on the resume for those of you who are aspiring is the Voice to Bridge AI consortium. They are doing amazing things with voice data as a biomarker for health. It is free, cheap, widely available, and can detect the progression of really serious diseases like Parkinson's. They're exploring ways to use this, and they're going to be hosting a hackathon on April 24th. It's $50 to join that hackathon. You'll be getting access to unreleased global international voice data that you'll be able to build solutions around. And you'll be with some very visionary AI and data types of health tech founders. And my final resource that I would like to share, and then I'll open up to Shure, Pitar, and Ken to throw some in there, is the Tampa Bay Wave Health Tech Accelerator that was mentioned earlier. They are not currently in session, but you can sign up to be notified when they do come into session. I will send all of these links out an email. Shure, maybe you have some specific resources for founders you'd like to jump in with?
I'd mentioned too that Tampa Bay Wave does accept companies from all over the country, so it's not just a Tampa program.
Yeah, that's important to know.
Yes, I do have. I'm going to go ahead and share the link for startups on AWS. There are tons of resources available. One I can tell you is activate credits, which gives, I don't want to give the dollar amount because I could be incorrect, but it gives you credits if you are a startup and you would like to run on AWS. And in addition to that, there are several other resources on this page, so please go check it out.
And I think too, we have one here in Tampa, but I think they're in every major city. There should be a link on the AWS website, but there's an Amazon Web Services user group meetup where they have monthly events. Folks come in and share projects they're working on. You can collaborate with other developers. So they're in pretty much every major city from what I know. So those are also good meetup groups to look for.
Right. Just one thing to add, we do work with a lot of the startup incubators throughout the country, and we do have a lot of resources for startups. So whether you're looking for a set of policies that you can use to meet the HIPAA or SOC 2 requirements, or you want to run some questions by one of our subject matter experts, feel free to get in touch. We don't charge for any of that.
And we'll include LinkedIn details for Pitar, Ken, and Shure